Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I do appreciate it. I wrote my weekly piece for The Star. It was called Geopolitical Musings. Don DeLillo, in his book Cosmopolis, says, "Everything is barely weeks, everything is days, we have minutes to live." And certainly the 21st century is a world hurtling at a dizzying velocity. Where once we were far away on the frontier of our world with less than 15,000 landlines with which to connect to each other, today millions of mobile phones connect us all to the world. This has happened over the last decade. The mobile phone, in my view, has flattened the world and has precipitated a rapid convergence of expectations worldwide. In some instances, and particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, we saw these expectations simply explode and then get throttled. I call it throttling. Others might characterize it as a repression. You can throttle only for so long, because then history shows that when the tipping point arrives, everything simply gets blown away. Gil Scott-Heron famously announced the revolution will not be televised in his poem and song from 1970. However, I recall the Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 79, which was televised and which I watched unfold on my TV screen. More than 30 years later, the US is still grappling with the Iranian theocracy and the consequences of that revolution. Interestingly, there is a school of thought that the kingdom is now as brittle as the peacock throne. It is this sense which might be informing the pivot, after a fashion, to Tehran. The counter-revolutionary forces cannot keep a lid on things for a meaningful time. It is a pressure cooker. There is a canard propagated by the right in the US that President Obama is somehow spineless when it comes to projecting American power in the 21st century. The failure to bomb Bashar into the Stone Age is always cited as evidence that Obama blinks, and that this has emboldened the likes of Vladimir to munch Crimea. In my opinion, President Obama has been incredibly aggressive. Just look at the drone fatalities chart and compare Obama's numbers to the period under President Bush. Obama has been red in tooth and claw. He has espoused a very sophisticated toolkit that has encompassed currency war. Take a look at something like the Iranian currency, cyber war, and a number of other strategies which, whilst they might not serve us up the spectacle of the Iraq war, are nevertheless just as effective but more subtle. It is not Putin who has parked himself somewhere right up against Obama's rear end. It is President Obama who has parked up Russia's European end. Various iterations of the revolution from Benghazi to Kiev were largely manufactured in a laboratory somewhere in the recesses of the US national security complex. Putin, of course, is a formidable adversary, and in a very cute move inverted the R2P right to protect rule in his favor and over Crimea. It was the right to protect civilians in Benghazi from the wrath of Gaddafi rule which was used as justification to overthrow him and his Green Book. And let's be frank, Crimea has always been Tatar and Russian. No one really believes that Crimea is European, do they? This Crimea referendum business is, however, a geopolitical conundrum for China. The problem being, if you allow that periphery states can vote, then you will definitely see a whole lot of China peel off real quick, from Tibet to Taiwan to Xinjiang. Which brings me to my next point, the tone of US media when it comes to advocating the US position is just too strident and unipolar in what is now a more diffuse but connected world. It was Hillary Clinton who alerted us to an information war, and she thought the US was losing it. And finally, when Bouazizi self-immolated and triggered a brush fire across North Africa, I recall everyone dismissing such a brush fire could leap the Sahara and enter sub-Saharan Africa out of hand. And that's right for now, but for how long? I'll put up a photograph of Gil Scott-Heron, and I'll just read you a few lines from The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials, because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. It was a great honour and privilege to host the East African Secretary General, Dr. Richard Sesibera, on Saturday at Mindspeak, and he said many interesting points, and I'll put up a photograph where he was making the point that, the EAC was very fast growing in the world, even without oil and gas. He showed us a map of how our 54 small economies fit in the world map. I'll put that up as well. And then I found an infographic illustrating internet use in Africa, which represents 7% of global internet users, which I'll put up as well. I like this photograph that that Kurab on Twitter sent to me just as I was introducing the Secretary General. And there were many interesting tweets, and there's a selection on rich wrap-ups. We have to catch up and compete. There is an urgency. We cannot wait 50 or 60 years, he said. He's exactly right. He made an interesting point, said that Tanzanians are the slowest in moving non-tariff barriers, but Kenyans are the fastest in removing and then reintroducing them. And Caroline Keir said, his words are slow and succinct, a lot to think about. We need to forget chasing flags. Detto, very intellectually stimulating discussions, keep the conversation on the EAC. Don't agonize, please organize, he told the youth about involving themselves in the affairs. Look for a language that will make you money, invest in it. He mentioned that South Sudan has applied to join the EAC, Somalia as well. There are a number of links. We started the session by playing the East African Community National Anthem, which was in Kiswahili, and I got everybody thinking. He's saying that manufacturing contributes less than 10% to GDP, but industrialization policy targets at least 40%. It made a point that on average in the EAC there are 135 million people. He says the 135 million chicken. Let's create wealth first. Let's not get into fights about sharing a non-existent cake, he said. EAC GDP combined is smaller than Angola alone. That got everyone thinking as well. And extremely interesting guest. I'm grateful to the Secretary General. In 2007, the United States economy was 4 times as large as that of China. By 2012, it was only twice as large. Interesting video from Jerome Booth, who I worked with a long time ago at ANZ Bank, talking about the powers in the periphery, and it's very worthwhile. The link is on Rich Wrap-Ups. Home thoughts return to the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the leftover glow from the first moment of the cosmos. I'll put up an image. Red and blue patches represent fluctuations in the smoothness of the light of only 1 part in 100,000. From there I jump to Don DeLillo, who says there are dead stars that still shine because their light is trapped in time. Where do I stand in this light which does not strictly exist? I like this photograph I found on Flickr of an oyster with lemon juice, elderflower, hibiscus gelée, compressed cucumber and lime powder. which reminded me of some rather tasty oysters I had in Washington exactly 503 days ago. Putin calls Obama to discuss situation as Russia positions 40,000 troops along the border. Obama suggested Russia put a concrete response in writing, and the presidents agreed that Kerry and Lavrov would meet to discuss next steps. Kerry subsequently diverted his flight on Saturday to attend the talks in Paris, but from what I can gather, I don't think much was achieved. And when I looked at the transcripts that were issued by Obama about that telephone conversation on the Washington Post and by Putin, it really was miles apart. South Korea returned artillery fire after North Korea lobbed shells over the two countries' western sea border, pushing tensions to their highest in months. We've got to keep an eye on that. The exchange of fire, North Korea began its drills at about 12:15 p.m., but I think it's the US and South Korea which have been doing some drills, so I think this is probably a response. Interesting article in Debka saying Turkey has ratcheted up its intervention in the Syrian war to an unprecedented level. For the first time in the 3-year conflict, the Turkish army is allowing Syrian rebel forces, including the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Nusra Front, passage through Turkish territory for their offensive to capture the northwestern Syrian coastal area, where the Assad clan's lands are situated. Ankara's support for the rebels is inclusive. Turkish troops are posted at the roadside with supplies of ammo, fuel, food, mechanical repair crews and medical aid for rebel forces as they head north. Turkish Air Force gives them air cover, and Turkish agents arm them with surveillance data on Syrian military movements ahead. Debka is, of course, an Israeli government site, but nevertheless that's an interesting point and confirms the leaks, the audio leaks we heard. Philippine ship dodges China blockade to reach South China Sea outpost. Philippine government vessel made a dash for shallow waters around the disputed reef in the South China Sea, evading two Chinese Coast Guard ships trying to block its path to deliver food, water and fresh troops to a military outpost on the shoal. Saying it's a reminder of how assertive China has become in pressing its claims to disputed territory far from its mainland. And clearly, this could be a real flashpoint. A US Navy plane, a Philippine military aircraft, and a Chinese plane, all visible from their markings, flew above the ships at different intervals. I've got to keep an eye on that. The United States does not seek to militarize cyberspace. Chuck Hagel told an audience at Fort Meade, Maryland, the home of Cyber Command and the NSA Signal Spy Service. I like this photograph, which is of a blast from a Russian Soyuz FG rocket as it lifts off from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Ian E. Cox on Twitter tweeted this: soldier couture shown best by Garangism, South Sudan. Thomas Dvorak's Taliban glamour shots and photo booth caught my attention. I'll put one of those up. Moving on to the markets. The interesting headline in the FT: the value of deals in the technology, media and telecom sector hit 174 billion during the first 3 months of the year, the highest level since 2006, as some of the world's largest companies battle to secure access to global consumers. I like this comment: it is the most interesting and disruptive time in the market I have ever seen, said Gene Sykes, global co-head of M&A at Goldman Sachs. Moving to currency markets, the euro 137.49 touched 137.05 on March 28th, which was the lowest since Feb 28. Awaiting an inflation number, which I'll come to. Dollar index 80.18. We're just pushing through this key resistance level. The key driver has been the weaker yen, which is at 102.97. That's popped the index higher, the dollar index higher. However, the dollar is down 2.2% against the yen this year. I think wait a little while and see if we can buy the yen a little bit higher again, like we did last time. Swiss franc 0.8871, the pound 166.43, the Aussie 0.9241, reached 0.9295 on March 28, a level not seen since November 21st, and it's had a strong quarter, up 3.6%. India rupee breaks 60, last trading at 59.9. That's on optimism we're going to get a clear-cut victory in India with Modi. South Korean won 1064.70, the Rial 225.40. The higher beta currencies relatively stronger. Egyptian pound 696.68. And the South African rand right up against resistance at 1058.17. The euro has declined 0.5% this year, according to Bloomberg correlation-weighted indices. The dollar has lost 0.6%. The yen has risen 1.9%. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar-yen. We're testing resistance here at 80.18. Yellen is scheduled to deliver remarks at a conference in Chicago. And remember, she said this month borrowing costs could rise around 6 months after officials end the Fed's monthly bond buying program, which was, I think, a lot more vigorous than many people expected her to be. So I think a little bit of nervousness ahead of whatever she's set to say in Chicago. Euro dollar 137.49, awaiting consumer price data for the region. Expectations are that it only rose 0.6% this month from a year earlier. Keep an eye on that. If it is at 0.6, I think you'll see the euro soften. Dollar yen 102.97. I'll put up a 3-month chart looking for a 104, 105 level for a trading buy of the yen. Gold, I'm going to put up a 3-month chart, 1295.735. And in my opinion, the 2014 high has already been reached. Barron's, on its cover for the Saturday, March 29th issue, says here comes $75 oil. In fact, you'll remember I wrote about $75 oil on the 28th of October when I said, in fact, if the US and Iran were able to cut through the noise into the chase, WTI could trade as low as $75. I'll put up a chart at 3-month crude oil. That's at 101.46, looking to resell it, frankly. I came across this, the $55 million hallucination watch displayed at the booth of the British jeweller Graf at Basel World. Sub-Saharan Africa, Zimbabwe is urging an AU boycott of the EU summit. We are waiting to hear if the African Union decides to go ahead and postpone the summits of the European Union ambassador in Harare. This is the highest level encounter between European and African leaders, has been in the diary for months, to be held on April 2 and April 3 in the Belgian capital. Preparations thrown into disarray on Thursday after a meeting in Addis of the AU's Peace and Security Council ended with a recommendation to the AU's 54 members not to attend the summit because the EU was trying to dictate who should participate. I'll put up a photograph of Grace Mugabe, who's the wife of President Robert Mugabe, who has been denied an EU visa application and has caused this response. South Sudanese rebels plan to capture key oil installations to force President Salva Kiir to step down and end more than 3 months of conflict, former Vice President Riek Machar said. Machar said the White Army is mobilizing to attack the Paloch oil fields that are the main source of revenue for the country's military. The 6-year-old rebel leader said in a March 27 interview at his bush hideout in Upper Nile State. Machar fled Juba in December after the government said he attempted a coup against Kiir. We want to take control of the oil field, said Machar, dressed in green military fatigues and wearing gold-rimmed sunglasses. This is our oil. We must take control of Paloch to deny Salva Kiir revenue to buy more arms. The country is producing about 160,000 barrels per day of oil from fields in the Upper Nile, according to the government. This is Dar blend, a low-sulfur crude prized by Japanese buyers as a cleaner burning fuel. Current output is probably about 150,000 barrels per day, generating about $15 million for the government and oil companies. Capturing Paloch would basically shut down the economy. It's really, this is interesting, the choke point for South Sudan government earnings. It's a major piece in the struggle strategically. As long as Salva is still in the seat in Juba, then I don't think we're going to realize peace in the country. Violence in South Sudan, of course, has pitted Kiir's group against Machar's Noyers. And Machar saying, I think he should be honest to himself and see that getting a solution would mean him stepping down. Regarding possible IGAD deployment to secure oil installations, the deployment would be hostile and treated the same as Uganda's army fighting alongside South Sudan's military, Machar said. They have no right to deploy in our oil fields, he said. If they want to colonize us, we will fight them. Glaxo say they're going to invest millions in factories and jobs for Africa. GlaxoSmithKline considers Africa to be at an economic tipping point and believes it will be one of the world's most important growth drivers within 20 years. The South African oil share is up 4.67% this year. Dollar versus Rand, 10.5808. The Rand is right up against resistance. If it gets through this level, it goes to 10. Egyptian pound, we've been here for eternity, 6.96. The Egyptian stock market, coming off its 2014 highs, remains the best performing market in Africa up 20.14% this year. Nigerian oil shares down 6.17% in 2014. There have been a number of reports that came out of Nigeria the weekend. The first one I read was saying that the president was safe and well. It denied speculation that the Aso Rock presidential villa was under attack early Sunday morning after prolonged gunshots were heard. This is at the SSS headquarters. The government is saying it was an attempted jailbreak which has been effectively foiled. There is no cause for alarm. What happened at the SSS HQ has nothing to do with the villa. President Jonathan is safe and well. Thank you for your concern and support, he tweeted. Subsequently, Reuters is saying detainees suspected of being members of Boko Haram overpowered their guards at a prison near Nigeria's presidential villa in Abuja, seizing a rifle and triggering a gun battle that killed 21 people. However, numerous eyewitness accounts do not believe this story that the government is putting out. An increase in attacks by Boko Haram and uncontrolled reprisals by Nigeria's security forces has seen the death toll in northeast Nigeria rise to at least 1,500 people, more than half of whom are civilians, in the first 3 months of 2014. Amnesty International put up a photograph of a group of young men killed in Potiskum, Yobe State by the security forces following an attack by Boko Haram in a nearby village. The Ghana Stock Exchange is up 11.32% in 2014. However, Ghana's debt outlook was lowered to negative from stable by Fitch, which said the government's policy credibility is at risk from above target budget deficits for the past 2 years. Ghana's fiscal deficit last year expanded to 10.8% of GDP from an estimate of 10.2% in November. Tax revenues declined, spending on wages increased according to the Finance Ministry. Gap ballooned to 12.1% of GDP before elections in 2012. Policy credibility has been significantly weakened following 2 years of double-digit and larger than expected budget deficits. The cedi has declined 20% against the dollar last year and has fallen a further 12% this year, entirely eroding the gains that you saw on the stock exchange. It is the worst performing African currency in the first quarter. JP Morgan are predicting it could fall a further 20%. And I spoke about this in my piece on the 24th of March, when I said, mixed performance continues to be witnessed in Africa's markets. I was talking about the Egyptian stock market. Ghana, I said Ghana's Eurobond now has a 9% handle, and sentiment has soured so much it is entirely feasible that Ghana might print double-digit yield. Ghana is a near-perfect harbinger of what can go wrong when you front-load your recurrent expenditure in the expectation that revenues are a rising tide. The open question is whether Ghana is in the cockpit or whether the markets will simply elbow the government aside. Now, that remains the issue. The MPC increased the key lending rate to 12% from 10.25%. This is Zambia. They too have been under tremendous pressure, in particular because of the falling copper price. Interesting story about seaweed in Zanzibar and how it produced a living for a lot of women, but now they're unable, exports fell by 4,000 tons last year from the 2012 high of 15,000 tons, saying that there is some issue with global warming probably. A Belgian woman was wounded in a machete attack in a Mozambique in around Pemba. The woman nearly had a hand chopped off in the overnight attack at a house in a village near Pemba. Crime very rare in the area. In the 7 years we've been living here, we've never had an incident of this kind. I'll put up a photograph of Pemba Airport taken 663 days ago, and another photograph of Pemba from the air that I took that very same day. Interesting article in the Wall Street Journal. It's on Rich Wrap-Ups because, of course, it's a subscriber model talking about a bull market of a different kind, wealthy investors in South Africa jumping into an especially exotic asset class, big game animals. Interesting data about that. Coming to Kenya, the Kenyan president has said the tourism sector is on its knees after attacks. We all have a responsibility to bring this to an end. Tourism has been greatly affected by these terror activities. The industry contributes 10% of the GDP, is virtually on its knees. Tourist arrivals in Kenya in the first 5 months of 2013 were down 15% on the previous year, as visitors stayed away, worried by attacks blamed on Somalia's Al-Shabaab and by fears of trouble around elections in March. So, it's very soft indeed. I've been down to the coast a number of times and I was just shocked by how few people were there. Kenya grants conditional approval for sale of SR Telecom. The acquisition can proceed subject to conditions including the payment by Safaricom and Airtel of license fees totaling $5.4 million each. SR is also required to pay all outstanding regulatory fees. The matter has received due attention from the authority. The parties have been notified of the decision of the authority. Other conditions listed in this, there were some conditions precedent. Implementing a national roaming service and a written commitment on how mobile phone users will benefit from the service, and then saying Safaricom has to share both its passive and active infrastructure with its competitors. In particular, and I'll come to this in a moment actually, let me come back to it. Kenya police have killed 2 suspects who are suspected for the church killings in Likoni. I'll put up a photograph of the body of the worshipper lying on the floor inside that Joyland church in Likoni where the attack happened on Sunday the 23rd. President Kenyatta's spokesman tweeted this photograph, which I liked, of the president and his deputy meeting the Eastleigh business community. Kenya is in talks with Standard Bank and AFDB on airport project funds. Kenya's government is in talks with 4 companies, including Standard Bank, about funding the construction of a $653 million airport terminal, the Kenya Airports Authority said. Discussions with the African Development Bank, China Development Banks, AAE Systems about funding 85% of the project cost. The first phase of construction of the new terminal in Nairobi will begin in July and is expected to end in 2017. Okay, getting back to what the Communications Authority of Kenya, what conditions precedent it's made. Francis Wangusi, the Director General, said approval of the deal now depends on Safaricom and Airtel submitting to the authority for approval a framework for sharing agent outlets for various mobile consumer services, including money transfer services and SIM registration centers. And basically that's demanding that M-Pesa, which is currently a closed garden, is opened up to the other operators. I cannot see Mr. Collymore accepting that as a condition precedent. I think he's probably going to just let you expire on the vine. Interesting piece in the FT about Africa's digital money heads to Europe. The mobile payment system that revolutionized business and banking in sub-Saharan Africa is to come to Europe as Vodafone seeks to spread the popular digital currency outside emerging markets. Vodafone has acquired an e-money license to operate financial services in Europe. Plans to launch M-Pesa in Romania as a first step to potential expansion in the region. Hoping to win over 7 million Romanians who mainly use cash. So that's an interesting development. M-Pesa had 16.8 million active customers at the end of last year. I'll put up a photograph of M-Pesa from 689 days ago opposite the Safaricom building, and it really is the jewel in the crown. And then 573 days ago I was in Switzerland, and the chairman of Credit Suisse said mobile payments are more popular in Kenya than in Switzerland. I'll put up a link for an interview I did with Bob Collymore immediately after his first half earnings release, a link for the share